Welcome back, everyone. You're watching Press TV World News. Russian troops are in Belarus for joint military drills in less than just 2 weeks. Russia's defense ministry has released footage of the arrival of the soldiers. It's also issued a statement saying the drills are aimed at practicing the coordination of allied forces. Joint exercises are set to start February 10th for a 10-day period. This amid simmering tensions between Moscow and the West over Ukraine. NATO says it is closely watching Russian moves in Belarus. Meantime, the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, says his country will go to war if Russia is attacked. Lukashenko says Belarus is prepared to host hundreds of thousands of Russian troops in case of conflict. Joining us now from London is Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian and political analyst and author. Hello, Mr. Papadopoulos. Always a pleasure to check in with you, sir. Now, a new video released by the Russian Defense Ministry shows the country's forces having arrived in Belarus for these joint maneuvers amid heightened tensions with the West over Ukraine, obviously. In which direction do you think the Ukraine developments are moving, and how possible is real military confrontation now between the two sides?
Well, Belarus is Russia's most important friend and ally on the international stage. Indeed, during the 1990s, Moscow and Minsk created the Union State of Russia and Belarus, which envisages full union between the two countries. And whilst a merger of Russia and Belarus has yet to occur, nonetheless, when it comes to defense matters, Russia and Belarus are unified. Indeed, we can go as far as to say that the Belarusian armed forces are de facto a part of the Western military district of the Russian Federation. So when Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus says that if Russia is attacked, Belarus will go to war against that country attacking Russia, he is referring to the Union State of Russia and Belarus, because an attack on Belarus is an attack on the Union State, and Russia will go to war against any country attacking Belarus. And likewise, an attack on Russia is an attack on the Union State. Therefore, Belarus, as I said moments ago, will go to war against any country attacking Belarus, attacking Russia. So that is why the Belarusian president has issued that statement. As regards a possible war between Russia and Ukraine, well, it is very possible. Russia will not tolerate the increasing military presence of NATO in terms of its soldiers and weaponry in Ukraine. Also, Moscow will not tolerate the increasing supplies of military hardware from America and Britain to the Ukrainian armed forces. Furthermore, Moscow will not countenance America and Britain's increasing naval presence along Ukraine's Black Sea coastline, which is a threat to Russian naval supremacy in the Black Sea. So the ball, so to speak, is in the court of the West. In the last couple of years, and especially in the last year, NATO has increased quite dramatically its presence in terms of soldiers and equipment along the entire western border of the Russian Federation, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. So the situation is now extremely tense because NATO is increasing its presence on the Polish-Belorussian border, which means the border of the Union State of Russia and Belarus. That is why, or that is one of the key reasons as to why the Kremlin is deploying thousands of Russian soldiers to Belarus to partake in upcoming military maneuvers between the armed forces of Belarus and the armed forces of Russia. So Russia and Belarus have every right to increase the defenses of the Union State, because NATO, which is an adversary to both Russia and Belarus, is menacing the security of the Union state.
And why is that out of the question when the Russians want no more eastward expansion, and maybe a lot of people may feel that that's not really asking for too much there, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Why isn't Washington and its allies willing to entertain that demand that we don't want you coming up right to our doorstep, especially with offensive weaponry? We don't want Ukraine admitted into NATO. And not only that, Vladimir Zelensky just yesterday said that he really appreciated if the West, particularly Washington, stops talking about an imminent attack coming from the Russians that is only adding to panic in his country, something he does not and his people do not need right now, especially a war to go all the way with it.
But at the same time, President Zelensky is calling on the West to supply more and more arms to the Ukrainian armed forces and to build up NATO's presence even further along the western border of the Russian Federation. We must not lose sight of the fact that ever since February of 2014, Ukraine has been in the West's sphere of influence, courtesy of an American-engineered coup in the country, which replaced a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, with a fervently pro-Western and anti-Russian government. Now, Russia has every right to demand of America that it puts into writing that Ukraine will not be admitted to NATO. But of course, the Americans will not give such an assurance because the Americans are intent on admitting Ukraine to NATO. Because in that scenario, Russia would be completely encircled by NATO member states on its western border. But furthermore, in 2008, at the NATO summit in Bucharest, what is known as the Bucharest Declaration, NATO stated that Ukraine one day will become a NATO member. So it is absolutely imperative that the Kremlin takes all measures it deems necessary to ensure that Ukraine is never admitted to NATO, because a Ukraine in NATO would pose the most perilous threat to Russian national security since the threat of the Third Reich. Because NATO is menacing Russian national security. They are seeking to not just menace the Russian armed forces and the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent, but a Ukraine in NATO would mean that NATO, or America to be more specific, could try to encourage what's called a color revolution in Belarus, and to try and orchestrate something very similar in Moldova. So Russia will use all measures necessary to prevent that from happening.
Thank you for joining us. We're out of time. Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, always a pleasure. Historian, political analyst, and author joining us from London. We have